Music is the key reference. And one of the things that you see in a lot of the writing and references around Orphism, and we'll get into this maybe, is it's kind of one of the first stirrings of like abstract art.
I'm Kate Brown, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. In the early 1900s, art movements within the then burgeoning category of modern art were exploding in multiple directions, and among them was a strand called Orphism. What was it? Well, in some ways, it's hard to say. Relatively short-lived and debated even in its time, as soon as it was coined around 1912, Orphism is technically a form of abstract art, informed by motion, radial shapes, and vibrant colors. Most known and neatly associated with Orphism are Robert and Sonia Delaunay, who thought colors could be used to create visual harmony, where form and hue worked on a canvas in the same way that notes work to build a piece of music. It's the artist as composer. And yet the contours of this movement are still somewhat vague. In fact, there were debates about what Orphism was from within the group that was most often associated with it. As a movement, it's quite elusive. My co-host, the art critic Ben Davis, recently went to a major showing of Orphis works, an exhibition called Harmony and Dissonance, Orphism in Paris, 1910 to 1930, at the Guggenheim in New York, that opened earlier this month, and which runs till March 2025. We discussed the art form and its impact, as well as some of the unanswered questions that Ben left the show with. Hey, Ben, how's it going today?
Pretty good, happy to be here. This is really my favorite kind of episode to do, talking with you about some cool, interesting art.
Totally. Yeah. I'm excited to dive into the annals of art history with all the crazy things going on in the world at the moment. It's going to be fun to talk about this. So yeah, let's get into it. For those who are hearing this term Orphism for the first time, can you describe it briefly, or maybe just what does an Orphism painting look like specifically?
Well, that is going to be the big question that we're going to have to answer in this show, because I'm not sure there's a clear answer to that, either proposed by this show or, in fact, in history. Orphism is one of the classic avant-garde movements. It's kind of like the kind of art that the Guggenheim Museum was designed to show. It's art from the early 1910s. If I had thought about the word Orphism before I saw this show, what I would think of is colorful, semi-abstract painting, particularly the artwork of Robert and Sonia Delaunay, who you see right in the first major gallery at this show, who do these prismatic paintings that often feature these disc-like forms that kind of look like lens flares. Often they are of looking at the sun or looking at a light bulb, and it's as if you're watching something break up into colors. If you want a formula and you know a little bit about art history, I might say that Orphism has the structure of Cubism, but the bright colors of Fauvism, kind of art associated with Henri Matisse. That was the image I came into the show with, and there's certainly some art that's like that in this show, but there's a lot more going on in here. Orphism, it turns out, is kind of a slippery concept.
Yeah, with lots of holes in its concept, one might say.
lots of holes, lots of ambiguous shapes, lots of windows into the unknown.
Yeah, but I thought that was a great description. So as you said, there's this big show on Orphism at the Guggenheim. What exactly is on view there? How many artists? Where is it in the institution?
Oh, it's a big show. I mean, it's something like 80-odd paintings and a couple of sculptures and hard to classify objects, but mainly paintings. Nice-looking paintings, classic modernist paintings. It's a full museum show, or it goes up the entire Guggenheim spiral. I think that's a good enough explanation.
Great. So let's get into it further. So who coined this term exactly? And was there a key show or painting that sparked the whole idea? What was the catalyst for the Orphis movement?
So Orphism is a mutant version of Cubism. And when it comes on the scene, it's actually described as Orphic Cubism by this poet, Guillaume Apollinaire. And he first talks about Orphism as a thing around 1912. Cubism really gets off the ground in 1907, 1908 with Picasso and Braque making a sensation. And it attracts a lot of attention. A lot of artists come in who want a piece of the action. And Orphism is one of the things that happens as people are trying to figure out what to do with Cubism, where this idea goes. So Apollinaire first talks about it in 1912 in this speech he gives. This speech is given at a show of something called the Golden Section Group. And the Golden Section Group is a bunch of artists who are, I guess, what you call salon cubists. Picasso and Braque are the big first cubists, and then there are a bunch of people who come in and are developing cubism, trying to do a bunch of different things with it, trying to move beyond what is kind of a eccentric formula for painting, which is like taking classical still lifes and breaking them up into little boxes. So I would say that Orphism is one of a number of things that are inspired by Cubism and is kind of people trying to name what you do with this weird new kind of art that isn't just repeating the same thing. And also reflects, I think, Apollinaire being a poet, a certain kind of poetic sensibility, like a certain view that Cubism is kind of scientific. It's kind of like geometric, and that there are more poetic things you can do with this, more that relate more to the imagination and color, and that go in a more lyrical direction.
And it was named after Orpheus, is that right? I think that also is a testament to how the movement was also kind of sitting at the intersection between like literature and music. It was sort of like triangulated with a lot of things, right?
For sure, sure. Yeah. Named after Orpheus, which I think reflects a couple of things. Orpheus is the Greek god of music. So it reflects kind of myth and poetry and those kind of references. At the same time, yes, music is the key reference. And one of the things that you see in a lot of the writing and references around Orphism, and we'll get into this maybe, is it's kind of one of the first stirrings of like abstract art. Art that isn't representational, is not directly reflecting the world. Now, Orphism's kind of a hybrid. It's halfway between abstract and figurative. But one of the things that people are grasping towards as a way to think about it is music. That music doesn't have to have any concrete references, and maybe you can have painting that's purified of reference, and kind of that color can serve the same role that pure sound serves in music. And so Orpheus is in there. Orpheus also, I believe in the myth, he ends up getting torn to pieces. And so there's a connection to Cubism there too. There's a lot going on in that one little term.
Right. And as we'll talk about in a bit, some artists agreed with this term. A lot of them didn't. But maybe also just quickly, we can paint the scene a bit more, like, because it started in Paris, right? Started and maybe ended in Paris, one could say. And as this critic that you quote from the New York Times had written in 1913, it was one of many quote unquote new art cults. Yeah. So maybe just shortly we can paint the vibe socially, economically, and culturally, like what was going on at this time, at this like brink of modernity.
Yeah, sure. If you want to talk about Orphism in terms of a specific vibe, in terms of what it brings to the table specifically, or what when we look at it now, we see in it that makes it unique or characteristic, it is this very time-specific spirit, which is the 1910s in Paris. This is the Belle Epoque, the beautiful era. In France, it's the period of peace and relative stability between the 1870s and the start of the First World War. And importantly, it's a time where there's a lot of technological progress all at once. I'll read you a list of things that get invented between 1900 and 1912. So you got the Zeppelin, the safety razor, the neon light, the airplane in 1903, tungsten light bulbs, Einstein's theory of relativity, early plastics, early color photography, the helicopter, the Model T, the Geiger counter, the first talking movies, and the motorized projector, the brassiere. So things are changing fast. And importantly, this is a time of invention. This is when these things are invented and they're being talked about, these new things, but they haven't become necessarily mainstream. It's a time of like contrasts between the old and the new. You know, France is still a pretty rural country until after the World Wars, you know, so people have the sense of moving between eras, and those eras are moving upwards in a sense towards progress. And I think that spirit of technological optimism infects everything. And it's what art critic John Berger talks about, the moment of Cubism. And the moment of Cubism is this optimistic period of modernism where things are changing, maybe art can change, and it has this kind of like almost, I think now it seems, innocence to it in terms of how it thinks about innovation and what art can be.
Right. And certainly mirroring all those inventions, like had its eye on the future, right? So like, as you said, Cubism, there was Futurism and Dadaism that were all doing that in various ways. But interestingly, as I read in your piece, some of these artists from these other art movements are in the Orphism show. So maybe we should get into how everything is kind of unclear.
Well, the thing is, I think that if they did a show just of people who are technically classified as Orphists, it would be a small show. And it also would be pretty visually incoherent because the way Apollinaire defined and classified the Orphists, it's pretty strange, actually. You know, like I said, I have this certain image of Orphism based on the Delaunays, and that's pretty common. And a lot of who he threw in there were people who were doing modern art at this time, were kind of loosely in the orbit of Cubism, but it doesn't have that kind of colorful, sensational aspect. So the big example people might know who are listening is Marcel Duchamp. So people might have an image in their head of his painting Nude Descending a Staircase, which is this kind of almost totally abstract painting of a nude, except it's just a bunch of busy lines and kind of the, if you squint, profile of a nude. And it's not colorful at all. It's actually kind of blacks and browns. And there's a painting very like that in this show as a representative of what Duchamp was doing at that time. And that was being called Orphic. So if you go from that to the Delaunays, there's not a coherent image of a movement that comes out of that. Now, on the other hand, the show is full of a bunch of artists who were doing stuff with color and a sense of movement and a sense of capturing energetic fields from this time period that looks a lot like, you know, what my mental image of Orphism, and were kind of roughly contemporary, but didn't call themselves Orphists at all. And as a matter of fact, really bitterly argued with the Orphists. And in particular, this is true of the Futurists, the Italian Futurists, who essentially accused the French of being cultural chauvinists for claiming that Orphism was this new, exciting thing, because they were saying this. There's nothing they're doing that we didn't do first and better. And because the Futurists sort of took Cubism into this new direction of color and specifically of movement. And one of the things people said or thought Orphism was doing was capturing the sense of simultaneity. Simultaneous is a really important word in this period. It's kind of like they're immersive, like the way people throw around the word immersive now. It kind of means a lot of different things, and it's kind of a buzzword. Simultaneous was that kind of word. Sonia and Robert Delaunay called themselves simultanists.
Okay, so even they didn't call themselves
Orphists.
That's right. And they're the most sort of iconic pair that we associate with Orphism.
Oh, yeah. They called themselves something else. It was a label imposed on them. At a certain point, they lived with Apollinaire. Eventually, they kind of dismissed him, broke with him. They said, he's a poet. He doesn't really get painting. He's applying concepts that don't really apply to what we're doing. The other big person who's canonically a Orphist is František Kupka, a Czech artist, literally a bohemian artist, really interesting character, a mystic, nudist. You know, there's a very funny photo in the catalog where he is photographed nude, like sort of playing an empty frame as a harp. And so that really connects to the Orphism idea. And he was the first person Apollinaire called an Orphist, but then he leaves him out of the later ideas of Orphism. And Kupka himself didn't like to be lumped with anybody else. He was a really individualistic thinker. So the term kind of applies to a lot of things and really to no one. It's a very elastic term.
I was having a look at the catalog. Apparently, Kupka said that the idea of Orphism, quote, jumped from the head of a man who's poorly informed. So he clearly didn't have a lot of respect for this art critic.
I mean, a great thing about this time period is about just how salty they are. I mean, there's a lot of like narcissism of small differences. There's a movement of American artists called synchromatists who are represented in this show that looks a lot like Orphism, or again, the mental image of Orphism, like sort of round, very abstract, highly chromatic forms. And they have a quote in their manifesto that's like, to compare what we're doing to Orphism is like comparing a zebra to a tiger because they both have stripes. And you're like, really, man?
Oh, God. It's like I can totally just imagine these artists with like fierce Twitter threads if they'd had the technology at the time.
well, and the thing is that all the isms are branding operations, right? I mean, This is a huge age for print culture. There's just like a voracious print culture. It's part of the reason why a technician of words like Apollinaire, who is a poet, can have such a big impact. And everybody sees the attention that the Cubists get, partly because of all the controversy and irritation stirred up by what they did. And everybody wants a piece of that action. So everybody's coining their own movement terms. There are a lot of just like isms flying around in this period, some of which have passed on to history and some of which are totally like loose threads, with Orphism being somewhere in the middle of those two.
Right. It makes me wonder also, like, is it so exceptional in that sense, or was there a lot of debate behind all these other isms as well? Like maybe Orphism was a little bit more debated, but certainly these movements from historical perspective, like of, being a bit further away, they look a little more tied than they probably were at the time, right?
Oh, sure. I mean, a lot of people use the term cubo-futurism at a certain point, and it's just referring to anything working in this kind of like idiom of breaking down time and space. There's a very famous to art historians graphic from 1936 from the Museum of Modern Art, one of their first big shows of Cubism and abstract arts. Alfred H. Barr, the first director of MoMA, creates it. It's almost like an artwork he creates himself. It's like a flow chart of the European avant-gardes and how they influenced each other. And Orphism is in there somewhere between Fauvism and Cubism, but it's a dead end in the flowchart of modernism and how it all influenced each other and then becomes geometric and non-geometric abstraction at the bottom of the chart. Orphism's somewhere there, but none of the arrows connect from it. Arrows connect to it, and none of the arrows connect from it. It looks like a historical dead end. And I have to say in this show, that's kind of how it ends up feeling.
The war, though, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, like hit pause on this moment, however much of a moment it really was, which we're kind of getting into. What did that mean for like the shades of Orphism at the time?
Yeah, well, one of the things, if you want to pick something out that's distinctive about it, is this spirit of optimism in a lot of these canvases and technological optimism. I mean, there's a real fusion of excitement about artistic progress and technological progress. So most obviously in Robert Delaunay's paintings of the Eiffel Tower, he has all these paintings, kind of famous canvases in the show of the Eiffel Tower in kind of slightly cubist style, and then airplanes and sunbursts around it. And it really just captures a spirit when all this technological stuff coming into life was really exciting. 1910, around the time that he was working on those paintings, a scientist goes to the top of the Eiffel Tower, discovers cosmic rays, and another guy dies jumping off the Eiffel Tower trying to demonstrate a parachute. So it's like a really important like symbol of like that's bringing together all these technological associations. Okay, the point of that is Orphism really gets kicking around 1913, and 1914 the war breaks out, and this is pretty canonical art history that changes everything. And it would because, 16 million people died in the World War I. And World War I really surprised people. It maybe shouldn't have. You mentioned the New York Times article that I quote in my review of this Orphism show, and I was flipping through the Times digital archive, and in that same October 1913 issue of the paper, there's a front page article about Winston Churchill, who was at that time the First Lord of the Admiralty in Britain, making a speech daring the Germans to halt their arms buildup, to stop building battleships, and saying, if you stop building warships for 1 year, we too shall stop building warships and we'll have an end to this arms buildup. So there's like a sense of tension building, but I think most people were incredibly surprised by how savage World War I was. And specifically, it was this high-tech war. All this excitement about technological progress and human progress and living standards rising and, the great productivity of technology suddenly ran up against the fact that all these same technologies were technologies of death. And the spectacles of World War I were like spectacles of early chemical warfare, the early tank warfare, and just mass death events. And of course, millions and millions of young men and women, but mainly working class men, were called into the trenches. And that include a lot of the artistic avant-garde, these young, spirited people, including Apollinaire himself, who in 1916 was hit in the head with shrapnel and taken to a hospital and never recovered and died of the Spanish flu in 1918. So you got to imagine that not only did it, to a certain extent, physically sever the movement. It's a very transnational movement, and the war brought a sudden return of nationalism after this period of internationalization. And the Delaunays went to Portugal to wait it out. Kupka fought in the war, stopped painting for 5 years. People who promoted these movements literally died. And then more than that, just like the sense of the painting, which was this synthesis between technological and artistic progress, was severed. And so some of the artists, the talented artists who Apollinaire had associated with Orphism, like Francis Picabia, who's shown in the very first gallery here, and Marcel Duchamp, who I already mentioned, they're kind of like surprises here to a lot of people because they're better known as Dadaists. And Dada is really the classic art movement that comes out of World War I, which is this very skeptical, ironic, almost anti-civilizational, almost punk movement that just flips the switch all the way in the other direction, where it's just this essentially contempt that people feel during and after the war towards bourgeois culture. Like the idea of a synthesis between the avant-garde and bourgeois culture looked really naive after that. Now, last thing I'll say, because I've spoken a lot, is that that's me saying all that. In this show, which runs to 1930, you don't see that. The great interruption of World War I doesn't really register in the art. You just drifts along. And Kupka and the Delaunays are doing kind of the same thing in this show's telling. 10 years later, 20 years later, these kind of sunny, optimistic paintings. So it almost just feels like, if you want to take a lesson about art and politics away from the show, it's like the tremendous capacity of artists to keep doing what they like doing and to turn away from reality is one of them.
Right, like a Fordian way of making paintings before Ford had invented the system. Yeah, that's interesting. And maybe that answers the question about why no art movement came after it on that diagram by Barr, because if it just wasn't giving any kind of answer to the world as it looked after the end of the First World War, and then you have these movements like New Objectivity with Beckmann and Gross, like really like dealing with what actually had transpired in those years when 16 million people die, as you say, it's no small wonder that it kind of fizzled out. My impression is that this show makes the line between Orphism and other forms of abstraction no less clear. And I'm curious, like, what were your expectations going into the show? And Is this kind of fuzziness that emerged from it an intention of the curators, or was it kind of an oversight?
No, I mean, they say we're taking a capacious or a broad view of Orphism. There was some talk going into the show. This was going to be the year of Orphism. And I like a good, juicy art movement. So my question going to the show is like, is Orphism the one that got away? Do you like return to it and you see like, wow, this is so vital. This is so now. I mean, it's totally different. But a few years ago, the Guggenheim had this blockbuster show with Hilma F. Klint, who is a mystical painter and an abstract painter. And looking at that work seemed just so incredibly fresh and contemporary. The space of it, the way of thinking, her story, and the kind of references she was channeling. The show was a sensation. And I don't think Orphism really has that kind of juice as a thing, at least not in the shows.
They also picked a bad year for it. If they were going to try to compete with surrealism, they were very mistaken, because 100 years of surrealism this year, and that is a concretized movement in its relevance.
Good point. Good point. Well, I mean, I don't know that it totally snaps Orphism into focus. Orphism was this kind of woolly term that kind of came out of the artistic hustle culture of that era of, trying to compete to brand and name things. And it's a little bit confusing what it represents. Now, I think this show starts strong and kind of trails off in the upper levels. Like I said, like it feels like there's this moment of Orphism, which is really the moment of people trying to figure out what to do with Cubism, how to develop that before the war. And then the war happens and a lot of other artists are dispersed and a lot of the energy goes elsewhere. There are some Portuguese Orphists or Orphist-inspired artists higher up in the spiral and stuff. But it feels kind of like this pocket universe is what I describe it as in the article. However, thinking about the show myself and kind of reading through the catalog, reading some of the literature around it, does tell an interesting story to me about the birth of abstraction. And that's kind of where I land in my article about this story about Orphism and abstract art.
Can you expand on that?
Well, okay, so why is Orphism kind of look incoherent? Or, like I said, you have the Marcel Duchamp, you have the Francis Picabia next to the Delaunays, next to the Kupka, and they don't really look to us the same. It's not really clear what he was trying to name in naming Orphism. Like, what was the thing that he was getting at? And it's not really that clear when you read his theorization. I mean, if you look at the book, The Cubist Painters, and how he distinguishes Orphicubism from scientific cubism, which is the Picasso kind of cubism, he says, scientific cubism is the art of making new compositions using elements that are known, which is not very clear. And then Orphicubism is the art of painting new totalities with elements that the artist does not take from visual reality, but creates entirely by himself.
But the Eiffel Tower...
Exactly. So even the most abstract paintings by the Delaunays are essentially them riffing on what the effect of the perception of looking at light or looking through a prism. There's a visual reference there, although they become quite abstract. So what's he getting at and how do these all connect? The thing is, what he's struggling to name, and this is what the stuff about music really gets at, is basically abstraction. Mm-hmm. Actually, it's funny when you read the newspaper accounts of Orphism, like the one from the Times in 1913 that we've already mentioned, their take on it in the first instance is, here's the new thing. It's curves. The Cubists did boxes. These guys are doing curves. And they're kind of making fun of them because there's kind of like an eye roll. They think this is all just kind of like a gimmick and deliberate outrage and so on. But that article goes on to quote Kupka, talking about how he wants to make art like music. And what they're really getting at is that you can make art that's independent from a physical reference. It's not quite there. It's really confusing. Apollinaire's The Cubist Painters, I don't know if I recommend it as a guide to any movement. It's very confusing. But I think that's because it's a confusing moment. They are inventing abstraction in a context when they don't have a language for that. Abstraction still outrages some people today. And in their time, when there's still a relatively strong academic tradition, they're trying to define what artists can do that's not reality. They talk about photography quite a bit. And they also talk, and this is where the technological optimism comes in, and in a kind of ominous way, about dominating nature, but the mind dominating nature, that artists have been too deferential to nature. Apollinaire actually says something like, gardeners treat nature with less deference than painters do. The idea that we need to reshape nature with our minds. And he says, we must become the masters of reality. That's the kind of rhetoric that gets severed in World War I, incidentally, is this sense of like, that there's not something sinister about that as well.
Yeah, well, this is also like in the shadows of like peak imperialism
in
Europe too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So do you think that this show is going to change opinions? I mean, it's too early to comment. It just opened recently, whether it's going to be a blockbuster like Hilma af Klint was, but it's sort of, I might wager, not completely. That's a hard one to beat. But do you think it's going to change opinions about this art movement or cement it in some kind of way?
Well, in a word, no. It's a good show. Go to see the show. The Guggenheim's looking for a hit. And about a quarter of the art in the show is from the Guggenheim's personal collection. It's the kind of art that the museum was designed to show. It's fun. It's interesting. You'll discover some new names. Really interesting historical time period. But does it change that image of Orphism as being a kind of a cul-de-sac in art history? No. It really looks like a thing that appeared, struggled to define itself, and then didn't have that potent of an afterlife. Although there are a lot of like circular wheels and sunbursts in painting that they grow out. Is that enough to really like fire people's imagination? I'm not sure it does. It's kind of unfortunate in this show to a certain extent because there is an opportunity, I think, to make more of a case for it. Like Cubism, the kind of like optimistic Cubism of the pre-war period, the war does sever that. However, it really reappears in Art Deco, right? I mean, that's what Art Deco is. It's the popular applied version of Cubism.
I loved in your piece that you said maybe they should have called the show like Orphism and Friends and Enemies, which I know you said somewhat jokingly, but...
No, I mean, I think Orphism itself isn't much of a movement. I mean, wasn't in its day, like literally. None of the artists who were called Orphis really fit comfortably in it. It's just a kind of a shape that a puzzle piece doesn't really fit any of the available holes in the puzzle. But I think if you open the aperture a bit and think of it as this tending towards either abstract art or towards applied design, you get like a broader sense of what the Orphic energy was doing. And there's actually a show early this year at Bard Graduate Center called Sonia Delaunay, Living Art. And it really makes this case for Sonia Delaunay as maybe the definitive Orphist and one of the major artists in a way that this show doesn't. And the way it does it is that Sonia lived quite a bit longer than Robert, quite a bit longer. She lived well into the second half of the 20th century. And, you know, partly because she was a woman, she worked a lot more in crafts, like in textiles, in costume design. And that opens this whole other world. I mean, they had a very fruitful creative partnership. It's actually really lovely, their relationship, as far as I understand it. But she has this tremendous, like what she did, what she took away from Orphism was this synthesis of practical scientific interests and applied design, kind of like a passionate belief in color and design. And she just goes on to do all kinds of interesting stuff between art and design. I mean, there's a whole line of industrial textiles she comes up with. She trademarks the word simultaneity at a certain point to describe her line of fabrics. Wow. She is kind of part of pop culture almost. And in that show, there was like a car she decorated. And that is a different story of where all this energy goes, you know, out of the salon and out of the gallery. And I think really the accurate story of Cubism's impact is like tremendous impact in art, opened the way to abstract art, but also tremendous impact on design. And I think that Sonia Delaunay really sits at that juncture, between those two things and looks like the major figure of this time period in a way that this show doesn't really explain. It doesn't give the sense of her or any of these artists as having that kind of polymathic energy.
Right.
But I think that's really interesting.
For sure. I mean, it sounds like a brave attempt, and maybe it didn't succeed in every way, but it'll certainly, hopefully, inspire future exhibitions, like more shows that look at Sonia's legacy that will be generated from this exhibition. So,
well, it's got us talking, right?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Ben, for this chat today.
Oh, thank you. I could talk about it all day.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Carolyn Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.